Welcome to the Chapter 38 and 39 Flipped Classrooms. The Cold War and decolonization happened simultaneously and are really closely related to one another, but your book divides these topics into separate entities so that the Cold War goes from 1945 to 1992 in Chapter 38, and then in Chapter 39, decolonization goes from 1945 to the 1990s. And this is difficult, makes it difficult to understand how these two things are so interrelated. And also makes you have to backtrack a lot. So therefore, we're going to rearrange these chapters so that you understand these things are simultaneously and related events. And we're going to go with 1945 to 1975 as one chapter or one flipped classroom, and then 1975 to present as another chapter or flipped classroom. There's a lot of information in these chapters, but it's really important to pay attention to broader themes and main ideas. This map is actually the favorite Cold War map of Reagan, and it shows the world divided up into NATO and other allies of the United States, and then the Warsaw Pact nations and countries allied with the USSR. Your book also has a similar map, but it doesn't show the guerrillas and anti-communist guerrillas in these different regions. So the four main ideas from 1945 to 75 are the creation of post-war international organizations. Some started to keep nations out of war, some started because of alignment in the Cold War. New conflicts that form because of the Cold War. Even though it's called the Cold War, there are still many conflicts about it. The end of imperialist colonies, either because of independence movements or deliberate divesting by the mother country. And lastly, economic recovery efforts after the devastating half-century of world wars. And down here I put the domino theory. You might remember this from US history. This was Truman's idea that once one country falls to communism, its neighbors will soon follow. And you can see that with China and then North Korea and then Vietnam, etc. So it was a reason for America to get involved in those conflicts. So let's take a look at organizations during this time. The international politics and economic organizations are included those that wanted to stay out of the Cold War and those who wanted to take sides in the Cold War. The United Nations, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact are a couple of different organizations. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which would be those Western nations. And the Warsaw Pact would be people allied with the USSR. SEATO is Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. This is an aligned and economic organization. And then there was also organizations of non-aligned nations, with India taking the lead in this, who chose a third path of not being aligned with the United States or the USSR in the Cold War. Also, the Organization of African Unity, formed in 1960, was designed to encourage decolonization and then help band Africa together in order to support African countries in all kinds of things, from economy to defense. So there were political organizations with the basis of staying out of the Cold War, and then there were others that defined Cold War participants. The immediate post-war period also saw the creation of international economic organizations whose purposes were either to help with the post-war economy or reorganize regional capitalist and economic trading blocs. These organizations included the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, which gave economic aid to certain countries, the Marshall Plan being ones that allied themselves with the United States. and provided loans. And then the International Monetary Fund, which also tried to encourage investment in nations that were having economic issues or economic trouble getting lending. And then the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, which became the European Union. And also OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum or Exporting Countries, OPEC. There's also the GATT, or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. There are many flashpoints in the Cold War. The Cold War between the US and the USSR was fought in what were called proxy nations that supplied the two powers with their allies of the West and the East. The post-war flashpoints of the Cold War were in Europe, in Berlin, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, Asia, in Korea and Vietnam, and Cuba in the Western Hemisphere. Here I've written some of the conflicts. Berlin had the Berlin Airlift of 48, and you could look in your book to learn more about that if you can't remember that from US history. And then the Berlin Wall, which you see here, was constructed, it's actually two walls, to stop people from East Berlin from migrating to West Berlin. It was built by the Soviets, and it was seen as a symbol of the Cold War. In Czechoslovakia, we're going to learn about the Prague Spring, and then also the division of Germany. You can see under Asia, I've got the Korean War dates, the first conflict after the Cold War, besides the Berlin Airlift, and then Vietnam, 1955 to 1975. Cuba, learn a little bit about the Bay of Pigs, and also about the missile crisis. And then another thing that these nations were doing was the atomic buildup. And this was a brinksmanship, or not a brinksmanship exactly, but arms buildup that led to in the 1970s the agreement to limit stockpiles of nuclear weapons. These were called SALT, or Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, in Helsinki. This led to a softening of tensions, or détente. This should all be pretty much review from US history. So here's the division of Germany between the Allies, and this part would be the Soviet part with Berlin there. Great positioning. And that's why there's so much conflict there. Prague Spring. This occurred in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And in 1968, there was a leader elected in Czechoslovakia called Alex Dubček, and he was elected to be the secretary of the Communist Party. He tried to enact reforms that led to the democratization and more rights for citizens. And these reforms lasted until December, about 12 months, when the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact nations invaded Czechoslovakia to stop these reforms from happening. And this guy was ousted out of power, and as you can see, the protesters here and the soldiers, the leaders afterwards went back to how things were before, very restrictive. The Soviet Union did not want this to happen. Other conflicts included North Korea, which the United States got involved in pretty much immediately after World War II. North Korea was communist. South Korea had a European dictator. And in North Korea, you had troops that, supported by the Chinese, had a big offensive going into South Korea. Then the South Koreans, supported by the United States, from an invasion, pushed them back up almost to China. And then Chinese troops helped the the North Koreans push back basically to where the war had started, which was the 38th parallel. And in North and South Korea today, there's still not a peace treaty, an end to this war. It's just a ceasefire So this war was extremely costly in terms of lives, especially for the Koreans and the Chinese, but didn't really change the situation. Although today you hear about North Korea and its isolationistness. And then in Cuba, you had the revolution, which took out the European and American supported dictator. And this led to the nationalization of all of the sugar industry, which was controlled by mainly US businessmen, which is why we do not interact with Cuba today in terms of business, and you have to get special permission to travel there. So the American administration was very nervous about the direction that Fidel Castro was taking the Cuban government. So they launched an invasion in 1961 when Kennedy was president, called the Bay of Pigs, which was a total disaster where Cuban nationalists from America were put into the Bay of Pigs or dropped off at the Bay of Pigs, and they were supposed to take over the government, and it totally failed. Well, because of this 1961 invasion and also the United States placing missiles in Turkey and Italy, the Soviets decided that they were going to place some missiles in Cuba, named then at the United States, which led us to the Cuban Missile Crisis, probably the closest that America has ever come to war in 1962. Fortunately, this did not end up in a war. Okay, so moving on a little bit, and we're going to try to go quickly through the rest of this. There were big changes in technology at this time. There were huge advances in the Americas, or excuse me, throughout the world in technology. And these things are called for in the AP course description, but they're not really covered that well in the text. So we're going to supplement that a little bit by talking about them together. First of all, the arms race, which we'll watch in class, destruction of an H-bomb, hydrogen bomb. Nuclear technology really increased during this time to include power. Also, you had the space race going on with the Soviets bringing in Sputnik, but the United States reaching the moon first. Discovery of DNA, which has totally changed our medical world, as well as the first open heart surgery, which was done in Minnesota in 1952. There was also vaccines, the Salk vaccine for the polio, and birth control pills, which changed the way, in the 1960s, changed the way women were in the workplace and changed the way the whole country thought of women, and this led to women's liberation. In terms of consumer goods, you have radios, televisions, washing machines, dishwashers, vacuum cleaners, and of course automobiles that really improved the quality of life and also increased energy use in the West. But unfortunately, these consumer goods were not shared by all countries equally. This resulted in haves and have-nots and a wider gap. Here we can see a modern kitchen. Beautiful. And last but not least, there were many social issues, which we're not going to cover that much because I assume that you talked about these things in US history. They're very important, but they are not going to be, we're not going to go into them as much. So in America, you have the Civil Rights Movement with the Voting Rights Act and the movement away from Jim Crow and a more equal society. This also led to Black nationalism with people like Malcolm X, who believed that there was no way that America would ever accept equality and therefore required more militancy. Also, feminism, especially after the birth control pill, this led to more movements in women's rights. Youth movements, like you can see here, to end the Vietnam War and end poverty. There was also rock and roll, and we'll take a look at one of Neil Young's songs in class and how that kind of rolled into youth movements and the anti-war movement as well. These go together. Outside the United States, you'll learn about Mao's Cultural Revolution and the thaw of the Soviet Union, which we'll talk about in the next PowerPoint. Thanks for hanging in there. This was a pretty long one, but the next one will be a little bit shorter.